A warm welcome and hello to everyone joining us today from wherever you are dialing in from across the world. And if you're an alumnus, then welcome back to one of our virtual sessions. And if you are planning to join us this year, then we look forward to welcoming you to Oxford on campus. And you'll hear from our speakers today, and I will shortly introduce you to Dr. Athol Williams, who will be leading today's session. And my name is Corinne Young. I'm an Associate Director for our Programme Sales team within Executive Education at the school. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you for spending your next hour with us to hear more about our Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Programme and to hear about some of the key learnings and outcomes you can really take away from the programme to apply back into your leadership style. And next slide, please. So if you have already inquired about the programme before or been on the programme yourself, you know we deliver a traditional 3-week on-campus experience in Oxford. And that programme will be running in June and October this year. And we have recently launched a blended format to give senior leaders across the world to have a more flexible way to learn, with 1 week in Oxford, followed by a series of weeks online, and then with 1 more week immersive in Oxford to really apply those learnings and to discuss further with the faculty and the experts that we have on the programme. Next slide, please. And if you've already been in touch again about the programme, you would have seen some of these fantastic people online or over the phone. So we have Athol and Sally joining us today, who are two of the masterminds behind our programme. So Athol is the academic director for our residential and blended programme, and Sally is our programme director for the residential formats, with Louise being the programme director for our blended formats. And then within our recruitment team, there is Patricia, Layla, and Charlotte, who are on hand to answer any questions that you may have at any time about the process, the logistics, or the experience. So please do get in touch with any of these today or following the webinar. And how to get the most out of the next hour with us. So please do use the chat. Tell us who you are and where you're coming from today and what you're looking to get out of today's session, but also participate and use the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Please do post questions as we go along, and we have put aside time towards the end to answer some of those questions. And do reflect. So really think about your current context and your current challenges and how you can apply those learnings and adapt as well. So how can you apply these learnings into your leadership style and change the way you adapt to certain challenges, experiences that may come your way, especially in today's world, which is very complex, uncertain, and ambiguous. So Dr. Athol Williams, as I've mentioned, will lead today's session, and it's a pleasure to introduce him now to you. So Athol is the world's first poet laureate at a business school. Athol is also an Oxford scholar. He's a former senior executive and an award-winning poet. So he's known for his work on ethical leadership and moral courage. So you're in very, very capable hands today. So over to you, Athol.
Thanks so much, Corinne. And if anyone's worrying about having poetry imposed on them, don't worry. I won't recite any poetry now. But if you come on the program, we might very well do some poetry reading and writing. So welcome, everyone. Just to follow on from what Corinne has just shared with you, our objectives for the session is to take a reflective look at how all of us respond to complexity, to ambiguity, and to uncertainty, both in the organizations where we work and in the world around us. We're going to focus quite acutely in this session, as we do on the program, on the practice of leadership. So there'll be constructs and theory that underpins everything we do, but importantly in this session and on the program itself, the focus is on how we as leaders actually go about getting things done with and through others, the practice of leadership. We will learn a process to diagnose complex issues, and we will hear how these concepts can be applied to a real life challenge from someone who's actually been through the program So we'll get a real life example of someone's experience of being through the program and applying this in their real world. If we think about the aspiration we have as leaders, and as Corinne said, I worked in business for 20 years across multiple geographies, multiple industries. There are a number of aspects to our aspiration as leaders. We want to come on a program like the Oxford program for personal growth. We want to build our capabilities around inspiring others. Importantly, we want to get sharper at getting things done, meeting objectives, delivering results. These are all part of our roles as leaders, but also to achieve personal success and ultimately be a leader the world needs, which is one of our key objectives of our program, is to look at the world as it is with all of its complexity and ask ourselves, what kind of leader do I need to be given that world context? And how then am I going to be an effective, successful leader? If that's the aspiration, of course, the challenge is part of what I just hinted at, which is the idea that the world is extremely complex. And no one has to be convinced of this idea. There's complexity that arises from a whole range of elements, whether it's political or geopolitical. Technology introduces a whole range of complexities. Our engagement with the biosphere. We have workforce complexity as our workforces are changing over time, and also how technology is impacting that. We have societal complexities, markets, the contagion across our economic and financial markets adds enormous complexity to our work we do. We have regulatory, competitive, economic complexity. And you could probably add as many more elements of complexity that we deal with. And of course, as a leader, the first thing we've got to do is recognize this complexity, understand its source, understand its impact on our business or our organization before we can do anything with it. And so, an important part of the OA MLP is for us to have experts share with you some of the mega trends, the big disruptors we are seeing in the world, and looking ahead to see what they might look like, how they might shape the world we live in. But just understanding this complexity isn't enough. At the end of the day, for us as leaders, we've got to go and still give people direction. We've still got to lead our organizations. We've still got to make decisions. And so, importantly, we've got to move from this complexity and embracing the complexity, not ignoring it, but moving to some elements of clarity around what this means for my business, for my industry, for my environment, for my role. And so taking this jumbled up mess of complexity and beginning to see what insights we can draw from it, what patterns we see. Are there particular trends that are unique to our industry or going to impact our business that we need to be particularly aware of? We're going to need foresight that we can have to draw from our insights around what's happening around us. And importantly, in terms of strategy, in terms of making long-term investments, in terms of making long-term decisions in our organizations, we're going to have the ability to anticipate what's coming, to form some sense of scenarios and prediction around what lies ahead. And so the bulk of the program on AMLP is going from understanding complexity through these different constructs and tools and frameworks we'll share to get to the point of some clarity. But again, you're asking, well, but what sits at the end of this, right? Okay, so I've got some clarity. I've still got to go and make some decisions. I've still got to get things done. And my view as a career strategist is that ultimately we've got to get to the point where we know it's those one or two threads. It's those one or two key actions I've got to take that's really going to drive my organization forward, that's really going to drive towards results. And you will see the dotted line of the arrow there to indicate that while the first moving from complexity to clarity might have a lot of robust ways of doing that, it's much harder to move from understanding my environment, having some sense of clarity around it, but then taking actions with the comfort and the confidence of knowing what the outcomes might be and what the results might be. And this again is an important element of the program in thinking about strategy, in having strategy-led leadership approaches. But how do we then get others to support that? How do we get our staff on board? How do I convince my peers? How do I sell these ideas to the board, to regulators, to unions, etc.? So we've moved from that idea of the aspiration, which we all share as leaders, to the reality we find ourselves here of living with complexity, having to embrace it, and move with difficulty to clarity and uncertainty. But these are exactly the challenges we wrestle with on the program through the different interventions we have. Um, and perhaps at this point, I want to bring in my colleague, Sally Bonneywell, who's the program director of AMLP, and just get Sally's reactions to what I've just shared. Sally.
Oh, Athol, you're such a strategy guru. I know you are, and you come up through a strategy, but I get frustrated with the strategists and strategy being everything. Because if I was to challenge you and say, what would you say to how useful have the strategies been when the last 6 months the world has changed so much and so fast? What use is having a strategy?
Uh, well, I've spent 20 years, making my living by selling strategy work. So I've got to have a good answer to that, Sally. Um, I think it's interesting you raise that because I think there are often two reactions, right? One reaction is the world's so complex. From the moment we put a full stop to our strategy, it's already become obsolete,
Yeah,
which is part of what you're indicating. And so why even bother with strategy? I
yeah.
think the flip side of that view is because the world is so uncertainty and so uncertain and so complex and so volatile, all the more reason to have a strategy that guides our actions, that gives our organization direction, that at least points to where we're going to make the big investments and big interventions. I think the key thing here, Sally, is that there isn't certainty around it. I think strategy must deliver or guide the pursuit of certainty. Because of course, I want to know that if I'm going to invest X, I'm going to get the return Y I'm expecting. The markets want certainty. We all want certainty around that. But it's the pursuit of certainty, I think, that strategy must deliver. Um,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's some validity in your arguments. I get that. And I suppose I come from a perspective, I come from a more human perspective in that people are at the heart of, for me, people are at the heart of leadership. And this is ALMP is a leadership program. So strategy for me is one strand of leadership.
yeah,
But for me, there's a lot more around how do we as leaders, and it's a lot more around how do we handle ambiguity? How do we, as individuals and as leaders, handle the speed of change? How do we handle that uncertainty? And I'm just curious about, obviously you think about it, but what do you think about in that area?
yeah. I, I absolutely agree, Sally. I think there are multiple layers to this. So the strategist would often take a very broad view of pointing the direction. I think the leader's job is to make that happen, to make that real, to get that executed. And that requires a whole different set of skills than often the strategic skills, which are very analytical, very cognitive, looking at the market, looking at the mega trends, bringing down the implications to what it means for the business. But I think that's only half the challenge, or maybe even less than half of the challenge. The bulk of the challenge is then for a leader with their team to get things done. And I think that raises a whole bunch of different questions requiring a whole bunch of different skills, which I'm
Mm.
hoping you can begin to tell us about, because clearly I lack them.
I wouldn't say that, Athol, but well, maybe, maybe. So thank you. Yes. So I quite like. I don't think there's any one single approach to leadership, and that's at Oxford. We don't say there's one approach to leadership. It's too reductionist. It's too simplistic. What we prefer to do is to say there are multiple perspectives on leadership. The strategist perspective is one. This one I'm going to talk about shortly. Adaptive leadership is another perspective about the practice of leadership. We don't say there is a certain type of leader and you have to be that type of leader, but we'll present ideas, we'll present theories, we'll present things, and it's up to you to make sense of those and to come through with what you think, make what you think is your perspective, your point of view on leadership. So why I like the adaptive leadership perspective from our colleague Ron Heifetz over in Harvard. I love this description. It's about guiding groups to confront complex challenges that necessitate a shift in fundamental beliefs, values, and sometimes identities. It addresses significant issues that cannot be solved with simple or technical solutions. So for me, it's very much around the aspect of it's about people. Leadership is about how do you bring people with you? How do you inspire them? And particularly in times of change, in times of uncertainty and ambiguity, when you don't know the answer, what do you actually do with that? How do you lead in that kind of environment? So one of the big traps, we've called it a trap here, that leaders make that we've studied is that they will approach some of the issues that they're facing and they'll treat them as if they're technical problems as opposed to adaptive challenges, which are in other language, in other words, are complex or wicked problems where they're multi-stranded, where we don't know where they end and there's no given solution. But if we dig a bit deeper into the difference between these two things and why I think they're really important to notice the difference, because if we want to get something done, it's about how do we mobilize people and how do we address issues. So with technical problems, what's the problem? The problem is often a recognizable problem. And it's whether it might be an IT system that needs updating. It's complex work to do it. No one's disagreeing with that, but it's the solution is known. We've got to replace this with something else. So we know what we're going towards. What's the work? It's applying the current know-how. Now, a heart surgeon does very complex work, but he knows what he's doing or she's doing in that situation. And who does the work? Experts. Those people with the people who've got experience, who've got expertise, who have done it before. You call in the experts to fix a problem where you know what the boundaries are, where you know what the range of solutions is. If it's not a specific one, you know what the range of solutions are. Whereas adaptive challenges are a lot, I think, about what leaders are facing now, where they are unfamiliar or unknown. So classic one is about, in the technology sphere now, is AI and the use of AI, not the which AI platform, which AI machine should we go for. It's much more around the what is AI, what's going to be the implications of AI, how should we be using it? What is it that it's going to do to our workforce in the future? What does that mean for our workforce in the future? We don't know. The solution, we don't know what the solution is. So the solution requires learning. It means going into it with an open enough mind to say, we don't know what the answer is. How are we going to learn it? What skills, capabilities, mindset do we need in order to be open to learning what the solution is? And how do we make sure that we manage the stakeholders and the shareholders in terms of managing their time, managing the expectations, and so on? What's the work? Learning new ways of working, learning new ways of being, learning new ways of actually how we relate to each other. And that might be about how do we collaborate? It might be about how do we take a different perspective on the length of time frame that we're working towards, or the speed at which we're delivering, or who we choose to partner with. And who does the work? In the adaptive challenges, all the people with the problem must have some representation, or else you're only getting part of the system. So we're looking at this very systemically, because if you don't, then that can scupper you at the last minute. But also it can result in fixes that come from often come from above that generate resistance because they haven't considered things. And it's really important to ensure that you've got the representation of people with the actual, who've got hands-on knowledge or an experience of working with the issue and the problems that are generated. The perspective is another thing within the adaptive leadership challenge, and you've probably heard this before because it's well known. But typically for technical challenges, technical issues, we use the analogy of being on the dance floor. So you're on the dance floor, you're having a great time, you're enjoying throwing some shapes, and you must see Athol dance. It's great, you're there, but you only see what's immediately in front of you. So one of the things is about saying, let's go up to the balcony. Let's just take that perspective and look at what's happening across the whole dance floor. Let's look from the balcony and see, what's happening at the back of the room. What's the fight that's going on over by the bar? Who's leaving now and who's staying? Who's on their own? Who wants to dance? And so on. So it's about being able to consciously shift, even within yourself, to go onto the balcony and take that perspective before you come back and make some decisions and implement some things on the dance floor. And it's that ability to move seamlessly between the two, but to remind yourself to do so. So be on the dance floor so you know exactly what's happening, you're in touch with what's happening, but then go to the balcony as well and have a look and say, what am I missing? What are we missing? And be able to take the team with you to say, what might we be missing here? And therefore, how do we need to adapt? How do we need to challenge? How do we need to know what we're doing and challenge ourselves? So how do we overcome this misdiagnosis trap? Yeah, it is taking the time to diagnose, to really spend a bit of time thinking. Now, we're all senior leaders, we're all paid to solve problems and to use our judgment. And a lot of the time, our identity comes from our ability to use our judgment, to be able to come in with answers, come in with solutions to difficult problems. But there's something now that says, if we take the time to diagnose what is it really, because if it is a technical problem, it's a very different route to solution than if it's an adaptive issue. So taking that time and being able to hold off the people, some of the stakeholders who want an urgent, very swift action. So being able to hold that off and say, no, let's take the time to diagnose. Adaptive challenges require people to learn and change. So setting that expectation and mindset that it's not wrong to know, to get comfortable with the not knowing, to be able to say, we're going to learn this together. Mistakes, misunderstandings, and really not knowing is all part of that journey, is all part of the getting to grips with and wrestling with and understanding the situation we're dealing with. When we've seen this many times, when I'm sure you have, solutions are imposed from above, that creates resistance because quite often something will come down to a very complex issue and the response is they don't know what they're talking about. Why haven't they talked to us? Or they haven't got a clue. And it's really, really, we see it all the time. So the involvement of representatives from different aspects of the adaptive issue is absolutely crucial. And so, I mean, very simply, the real progress requires engagement and ownership. So people, when they're dealing with change, sometimes say, oh yeah, and what's the change management plan? As if it's a completely separate thing. And in our experience and what we found is that with adaptive challenges, the engagement, the working with people, and how do you give ownership and give some of the work back, which is all part of the adaptive leadership, creates that engagement, creates that ownership, creates that spread of actually how are we going to own this change? It's not imposed, and people have got skin in the game, to use a buzzword. Thank you, Athol. Well, I mean, I have not done justice to Ron Heifetz and his colleagues at Harvard in terms of their work on adaptive leadership. But we do it in a lot more detail on the program. We do look at it. It's a really useful practical practice of leadership, and it's that practice of leadership that we're interested in. So what we do is leaders bring with them a challenge, an adaptive challenge that they are facing. And we have small groups, and they work with peers in small groups and apply the framework. Now, there's much more to the framework, which we haven't got time to go into today. We've just focused on some of the pulling out the difference in terms of the diagnosis. There's a lot of things about giving the work back. There's a lot of things about how do you help with mindset shift, and so on, and what capabilities are required in order to be able to cope with change and complexity in this way, a lot of the inner challenges. But I thought first it would be really great to hear not from us, but to hear from somebody who's actually taken this framework and taken this practice of leadership and applied it in her organization. Now, Angela, thank you, Angela. You're calling in from New Zealand, so it's some hideous time in the morning. So thank you. I know you've had coffee, so well done. That's brilliant. Welcome. You attended the program in October in 2025, but do you want to give us a little flavour of the complexity of your situation, your context, so that we can understand a bit more about what you're actually wrestling with?
No, thank you, Sally, and Athol. Thanks for having me today. Yes, the program has been truly all grounded and inspirational for me, especially to bring back on the work that we're doing. We are an organization which is a government-owned sort of a research institute, and we're actually going through the strategy process of reflecting in the context of a major science system reform. So funding for science is reducing. There are kind of challenging in the context of rapid adoption of AI, geopolitical sort of shift, changing in trust on the role of science in society. So there's a lot of thinking that the environment is changing quite rapidly, is uncertain. And so the leadership team, we have been kind of grappling on how we vision a new strategy, how we take this approach. So the program was particularly important for me to reflect not only how to guide this process, but also to reflect on how do I approach the challenge of guiding the process, and how do I reflect on perhaps the assumption or the technical approach I would potentially take on guiding the strategy process, and where actually the concept of adaptive leadership really expands the mind and reflect on how you can vision the leadership as a team sport, how you bring others together, how you harness alternative way to guide a vision of the organization. So it's been particularly insightful on reflecting on not only on how I see the problem, but how do I react to it, and the decision that I take in terms sort of day-to-day sort of moving the needle from A to B on the process of shifting and reflecting on how we react, not only react, but we vision a step and a way of moving organization and the leadership team and everybody involved into that change process in a comfortable sort of way. The reality around us is changing not only rapidly, but also unexpectedly. And so there are a lot of kind of element of novelty. And so how do you approach novelty with a vision, and how you do that in a collective manner? As the program has been really give us the not only the time of reflection on this concept, but also reflection on how we react to those circumstances, and also opportunity to reflect on how do you want to lead in this context.
Great, Angela, thank you. fantastic that you've done that. And I'm really curious about what was the impact when you started introducing some of these practices, when you started doing things differently?
And I think it was interesting how, I guess, from a technical background, that you have the tendency to try to go for the certainty and the analysis and the assessing of all the possible options. And then you realize that actually by doing only that, you're making some assumption on how the world works. And some of the things that are happening now are actually breaking this assumption. Things are not going the way we expect. And so is stepping back and reflect on which are the perspectives do I need to hear? Who is not in the room that has that vision that will challenge or stress test the assumption that we might have as a team. And so really kind of pause and maybe also reflecting on the listening capacity, being able to listen and to bring that on board into the decision. I think that is kind of really kind of shift the approach to challenges. So that was and the program it has different. It gives you a number of little superpower that you can tap in the different contests. I think for me it was also important to reflect on where do I add value and what is my story and how do I want to lead on this. And that brings you that kind of reflection on there is different way to go from A to B. What is my way of going A to B, and how can I contribute and bring it to the table? And of course, how do we lead together in terms of how do we bring everyone perspective? Because in this uncertain environment, you want to make sure that you are doing in partnership and in connection, not only in the organization, but also outside.
Great. And you sort of mentioned something there that I would frame as sort of that self-awareness. I mean, it seems like that's something that's absolutely crucial to be able to do, not just sort of to be able to lead in this environment, is to being clear about your purpose, your personal purpose, and how it links with the organization's goals, and how do you then manage yourself as well as being aware of that.
Yes, and absolutely. The program, not only in the first week, we went through going almost like an overview of the global challenges and an overview of a number of cutting edge technique. We heard from leading experts on all sorts of fields and from organizational, from strategy, from organizational, how you create an organization that is coherent, that has in the second week, it was the week where we started to reflect on us and reflecting on who you are as a leader, what is that drives you. For me, it was an interesting to see how the voice of the people change when they're speaking on their purpose and they're speaking with their voices. So they're kind of there is a different frequency and a different emphasis in the way things get explained and you interact and influence others. And also reflect on your blind spot. What is the things I don't see normally, and how do I can see more, and how do I listen more? And despite an obvious concept, they might be obvious. I think the program had given that kind of experimental and an opportunity and time to process that transformation. And then leading into sort of the last week, it was almost like bringing everything together and see how that kind of you vision your challenge and how you approach. So the kind of last week, almost an integration of all the thread. So it was, I felt like I feel like I use the word transformation when you go to a yoga retreat, but I felt like we kind of went almost in a kind of similar journey of transformation in this leadership course.
Fabulous. That's really, really great to hear. What would you say about the sort of the value of having the diversity, the national, well, what would you say about having the difference that we have on the program?
Oh, I think that it's where the world is interconnected, and it's an opportunity for us to bring a different perspective,
Mm.
and also interesting how you deal with opposite view on certain issues, and so how do you navigate that what we're living today in the geopolitical environment, that kind of polarity of view, and how do you smooth out the difference and bring a sort of a common ground to the conversation. I think interesting. We had the opportunity to have the Oxford style debate, where we kind of challenge on, and some people have got to challenge something they don't believe, and so and that gives you that kind of perspective, and how do you counter argument something, and that gives you that perspective of the complexity, and also the assumption you might have why some people have certain view, and that gives you kind of some kind of superpower to say, okay, you can actually smooth the difference, and they actually a common ground, and then there is actually a way of bringing everyone together on a common purpose. So it's been interesting also on that perspective.
Yeah, I'll never forget that debate we had, where it was about, and Athol, correct me if I haven't got it quite right, but it was about something about human rights being a luxury. Now, economic development trumps human rights,
That was
which
exactly, yeah.
it was so, I mean, that came up in it came up in several of the conversations, but to hear other people's perspective on something that I, of course, would have said, of course, human rights, but to hear actually know it's a luxury and economic development must come first, very sincerely from people within the room. And we had a very interesting, not only the debate, but sort of the conversations afterwards.
Yeah, and it was interesting for me to reflect on why we might have had a different perspective on the topic. Actually, we had a similar purpose, so to make the world a better place. Perhaps is a different strategy to it,
Yeah.
and it's an important one as well. Also, people might have a different opportunity to make a difference, and so from the different people perspective was bringing sort of their power to make change in a certain context, where for other they might have opportunity to influence in another, and so the strategy might be different, but the ultimate purpose actually was quite common.
Yes.
And was very powerful sort of exercise experience of that day. Yes.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of the things that leaders are wrestling with at the moment, it's not the sort of right or wrong. They're the easy decisions. It's the two rights that are difficult, or what's the least wrong that people have to deal with. It's those close paradoxes that's important. And what I suppose one of the things we hope that leaders walk away with, and I hope you have, Angela, it seems like you have, is that ability, confidence to be able to say, I don't know, there's not one specific answer, but I have the capability, I have the skills by which I can handle this, and I know how to sit with, and I know how to get resources. I know how to work through these issues and stay calm myself, and be able to contain my anxiety so that I can lead others, even if when we don't know exactly where we're going, but you have a process to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then the only thing you can really control is the way you react to situation, and especially in this very dynamic context. And at the workplace, it can be quite stressful, because novelty and uncertainty, it's in itself a stressful state. So
Yes.
it's how do you kind of reflect on how best you can react to that. And of course, it's a practice. It's not a given skill. Is something you need to practice every day. You kind of need to notice it.
Yeah. Lovely leadership practice as it is. We need to practice this, absolutely. Angela, thank you so much for joining us in the middle of your night. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Athol.
Thank you, Sally. What a fantastic conversation. Quite rewarding to hear from Angela. and just how much she's grown through the process of being on the program. Um, so just pulling together what Angela and Sally were discussing and what Sally had shared earlier. Hopefully, you get the impression as you're listening to the discussion they're having that on the program, it's about wrestling with ideas. Uh, Very strong Oxford approach is not to give you the answers, it's not to tell you what to do or what to think, but how to think, giving you the tools, the constructs, giving you the right questions to ask as you manage and lead and navigate through this complexity. That's what this program is really about at its core. As Angela said, up front, to deal with the complexity, we will bring in the experts, and we'll bring in experts from the business school, we'll bring in experts from across Oxford. You will get the best, the latest and best input around macroeconomics, around technology, around the fact that we're living longer lives. All of those experts will come in. But ultimately, it's how we then make sense of all of that expertise, those insights, how we work towards clarity, that things really begin to have value for you. Because that's what we want you to leave the program with, a set of tools, a set of insights, but importantly, how to apply them in these real complex environments. And what Sally described around the adaptive leadership approach with small groups, we know you have small groups, we'll mix groups up, we'll have a whole range of different exercises. We have the Oxford style debate, we have one-on-one discussions, we have this whole range of discussions where you will wrestle with these ideas because that's our experience, that it's those who are able to think about this complexity in the right way end up being the leaders the world needs. And so moving from complexity to clarity to certainty is not a mechanical process. It's this process of reflection, this process of challenge that then moves us in this growth through the process. Well, that's what we wanted to share with you, just to give you a quick taster of what happens on OAMLP. We hope that it's sort of giving you a good understanding, a good sense of it. And what we'll do now is I'll hand to my colleague Helen, who's going to curate a Q&A from you. So please do type your questions if you haven't already in, and we'll try and respond to them as best we can. Helen, over to you.
Great, thank you both. Thank you all of you. We've had some really great questions so far. And if I go to first, we've had a few questions around the idea of moving towards clarity and certainty, and some of the questions say kind of in the real world. So the first one is, how as strategy partners, having conversations with leaders, can we engage with them to help them slow down the pace for them to be, the conversations to be real, focused and honest?
Yeah, that's a very important question. We spend so much time, and we at a business school, we fall into this trap sometimes as well of focusing on how we respond to the world, right? All of our agility, how we adapt to the world. And obviously that's important. But I think to that question, we've also got to realize as leaders of businesses, and certainly the larger our businesses are, we can also influence that world. And so when you're thinking about strategy, and certainly a lot of my work with senior executives of large corporations, it's about how we influence the world. We can influence legislation, but we can influence how competition works. We can influence what consumer tastes are. We can influence this world around us. And so I think an important element of strategy is not just saying, how do I respond to the world, but also how do I influence that world in a way that ensures my success, but also to constructively move society forward in a way that's meaningful.
Thank you. And I think the same person has also questioned how plausible is it really to move from complexity to one or two strands of clarity in a corporate environment where there may be a clear strategy, but there are also major external ambiguities and leaders are feeling ill-equipped during times of change?
Plausibility, great question. I put that dotted line on that arrow from clarity to certainty. I think it's a pursuit. I don't think we ever get there. I don't think we ever get to perfect clarity because it doesn't exist. And I don't think we ever get to perfect certainty because we can never know the future. We can never know what's going to happen. It's the pursuit of that clarity and the pursuit of that certainty, which is an important element of leadership. I think the most successful leaders, the most successful organizations have that built into their DNA because they bring up insights from the entire organization up into their decision making, up into their strategy formulation. And so it's that pursuit. We know the markets value certainty, right? We'd love to know that if we make particular investments or particular decisions, we will have the outcomes we expect. So we know that's what we want. You know, it's like a football coach who designs the strategy for his team to win. They want to win the game. They don't sort of say, well, go out there and sort of figure it out. But they know most of what they've planned will not come to into reality first go. And so it's about how dynamic can your strategy be? How do you adapt to what's happening? And that feedback loop, I think, is partly what Sally is saying in terms of a leader, that feedback loop and that reflection on how I then develop and grow as a leader, but also feeding that into your strategic thinking. And so this idea of strategy is a dynamic way of thinking about what direction do I travel, where do I compete, how do I win? But it's always dynamic. It's always gathering information and responding to it. And I think that's what takes you closer to that pursuit of clarity and ultimately that pursuit of certainty.
Thank you. Because yes, another question is building on that isn't speed taking decisions also an important capability? Because there's not always time for space or discussion and debate, and so isn't speed important as well? Someone has asked.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think the really good organizations and really good leaders are able to do it much quicker because they built that muscle to do this. And this is this important drive we are trying to work towards, and it's built into how we design the program. To say it's not, I think we get caught up in this idea of the complexity. But the really great, extraordinary leaders are the ones who say, I understand it, I know it will change every day, but I must ultimately do something on Monday morning. I must ultimately make a decision within this complexity. And so those who are able to do this quicker, it's not just about being off the cuff or shooting from the hip. It's the ability to quickly gather the right information, know what analysis you need to do, and very quickly bring your teams, your people, the right people around you together to say, how do we make this happen? I think that skill, those muscles, are what drive success in organizations.
Thank you. So moving on to the idea of adaptive leadership, someone has asked, what approaches do you recommend for resilient leadership in a world of continual emergent strategies and dynamic complexity?
Shall I take that one, Athol? I'll take the
Please.
hard ones. You keep going with the easier one. Resilience, absolutely crucial for both at the organizational level and at the individual level. And by understanding for you, what does resilience mean for you? So being able to take the breaks, to understand, it's not just about taking breaks, it's about understanding how do you resource yourself? What do you need in order to resource yourself? So that you are able to make decisions, or you're able to choose and differentiate between when fast decision making is needed and when a longer term or slightly more pause, where a pause is going to be more effective. So it's that differentiation, I think, is the important thing in terms of speed for me. But the resilience is about understanding how do you not let yourself be brought down and stay down? What can you do in order to be able to bounce back and resource yourself with the energy? So the program is very holistic, it's very integrated. We do fitness programs, we have yoga, we have mindfulness. Those are voluntary, you don't have to do them, but we really do take that integrated approach. And we look at the sort of physiology of leadership, the physiology of how do you manage in these environments which are far more demanding. How do you step back, and even in a sort of a 5-minute time span, how do you resource yourself? How do you bring your heart rate down? How do you come to a calmness for yourself that you are then able to contain the anxiety of others? So it's not all soft, fluffy woo-woo. It's really scientific based. It's very sort of evidence based approaches to resilience that we take, and it's eye-opening. People leave those sessions going, I never realized what I was doing to myself, let alone my environment. So it's really well worth it.
Thank you. That brings me on to something similar, which is, to what extent should leaders shift from a crisis-focused messaging towards a more positive framing of complexity in order to engage and motivate their community?
I'll leap in first, Athol, then hand it
Go
over
for
to
it.
you. Well, according to Heifetz, and I do agree with him here, sometimes you need to do both, not necessarily concurrently, but sometimes you do need to turn the heat up. And sometimes we tend to protect people lower down in the organization and feel we should shield them from urgency, or we should shield them from the real situation. And this is where that skill in leadership about differentiation of when to turn the heat up and when to turn the heat down. So when do you need to contain the heat or the tension, and when do you need to expose people to it, so to drive urgency when there isn't urgency in certain parts of the organization? So I would say it's a both and that both and skill, and but when to use either one is important.
Yeah, just
Thank
to add to that, Sally, at the program last year, we had a four-star general.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a three-star, four-star general from the military come and speak to the participants. And he addressed this question, talking about, well, sometimes in military situations, you've got to be a transactional leader. When there's a crisis, you don't have the luxury, or actually it would make no sense for everyone to sit around together and debate what the right thing to do might be, right? When there's a crisis, you as the leader need to be giving direction on what needs to take place, who does what, and get on with it. And then he described other situations. And I remember him physically walking across the room, crisis on one side of the room, on the other side of the room, when there isn't a crisis, when you have a different type of challenge then around thinking, what's the future of the organization? How should we prepare? How do we gear ourselves up? Well, that's exactly when you want to take time and not rush it and bring people along, engage more deeply and more fully. And so I think one of the key takeaways for me from listening to this four-star general was to have the ability to diagnose your situations and know what's required as a leader. And that's exactly what we're building into the program, saying, when do I behave in a way that might require me to be very clear and give direction? And when is it that I need to actually engage and be more of a facilitator, more of an orchestrator to get the best out of those around me in making those decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. You've just reminded me about one of the other fireside chat people we had, the ex-CEO of the racing team, and the commonality between him and the general was actually blocking time in their diaries to think, in their calendars to actually think and plan. And that was just the two of them were chalk and cheese. I mean, absolutely chalk and cheese, but both spectacular in their own environments. But the thing they both said was about the importance of actually taking that time for yourself to think, to plan, to strategize for yourself.
Thank you. So there were also a number of questions around the adapted versus technical challenges that you talked about near the beginning. Number one was, isn't there a human tendency to always turn to recognize a problem as a technical one because the ambiguity is more difficult to address, I guess. And then the second question was, does it always have to be either or? It seems that some challenges today are a mix of technical and adaptive, which makes them even more challenging to decipher and respond to.
Yeah, bang on. What a brilliant observation. More often, there's elements of both. And the trap that we fall into is treating them all as in the same way. So why we press the language and the separation of the two is so that you can identify which elements need technical solutions and which elements need adaptive solutions. Otherwise, you lump them into, yeah, the first tendency is go what we've known. We've done this before, it's worked, but everything's changed. So parts of it stay the same, use one technique there, parts of it not. So using an array. And I suppose the whole essence is giving people the capability to see they have got choices, they've got options, and to be able to say, and how, and the skill and the decision making and the acumen to know when to choose which solution and how to deploy it.
Thank you. We've had another question which is quite long, but it's got an interesting ending, which is talking about all of the challenges of things changing and everything changing so fast at the moment. But the final part of it is that the big question right now is whom and what do we define as experts? It's a nice, easy question.
I think that yeah, is a very difficult question to answer. I think particularly in areas, so I've got sympathy with the person who's asked the question. In fast moving environments, right? The research I did yesterday is obsolete today, and so who are the experts? I think being critical about what information we consume and what advice we consume is going to become far more important in the future because we are surrounded by, firstly, just fake news, but even beyond just fake news, it's things are so emergent, and so we are not clear who the experts are, who we can trust in terms of giving us advice. And so I don't have an answer to that. I don't have an answer exists to that, but it does highlight for us the need to be very critical and careful about what advice we take and from whom we take that advice.
Thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more.
Probably just one more, Helen.
One more, okay. So I think back to the adaptive leadership. Someone's asking, does it require a robust support system for leaders to minimize the emotional demands and the pushback usually caused by change?
It's not for the faint-hearted. I mean, it's hard work. It really is hard work, which is why we always think about it from the sort of the inside, the outside in, and the inside out. So concurrently, when you do that adaptive leadership work, it's about taking care of yourself and about building your sense of core, about your sense of purpose, about your sense of values. What do you stand for? So that you can withstand the sort of the buffeting. So you do have that well, or that sort of deep well of not just positivity, it's beyond that. It's that well of purpose, that well of why am I doing this and what's the strength, and that core you can come back to. And the more you can focus on and doing the work for yourself at the same time, then you're much more able to lead others. But it's hard. But then leading in organizations is hard in this environment, and owning that and admitting it and being able to face that is worth it. It's what we do.
Thank you. Great. So I think we probably haven't got any time for any more questions at the moment, but thank you to everybody who posted them. And obviously there are more questions that we haven't dealt with, but I've just seen one about AI, and there's obviously AI content involved in leadership on the programme in the first week. So yes, just in terms of OAMLP itself and the next steps, there's a QR code there if you're ready to apply. I know that we have people who have already applied and are already coming, but if you haven't already applied, just some key facts about it. It's the most substantive senior non-degree intervention at Oxford Side Business School. So it's 3 weeks in length, but also obviously the longer blended programme starting in January. It's ranked number 2 in the world for cohort quality by the Financial Times Global Executive Education Rankings. And the last iteration scored 5 out of 5 with Sally and Athol at the helm. So they obviously have had great feedback from participants in the last version and every time. Athol, as we've heard, is recipient of Excellence in Teaching Award and is the first poet laureate. I'm sure he will share some poetry if we're going to be on the programme. So in terms of the next residential intake, which is the 3-week version where you're fully residential, the application deadline is soon, so it's next week. So we would recommend either getting your application in or talking to one of the team if you want to have a further conversation within the next few days. Just looking ahead, There's a residential version running again on the 25th of October until the 14th of November. And then the blended version is 16 weeks starting in January. But there will be a further webinar with the programme director for that programme, Louise Watts, talking about that in more detail. The fees for each programme are £26,500 plus £3,500 for accommodation. And then I think there's one more slide for if you want to talk to a member of the team. There's a further information webinar about the programme, but you can also reach out directly to Patricia or Layla if you want to have a quick one-to-one discussion to see if it's right for you now before applying. But you can also apply directly if you feel that you've learned enough from today's webinar. So all that remains is to say thank you very much for attending. We will be sending an email with a recording of the whole webinar within the next week. Thank you so much.